So earlier this week, I looked at using Expando DOM properties in an Angular application, specifically in cases where building up a view model is not completely sufficient for implementing the logic of the application. And one example of that would be when using the IntersectionObserver API in your Angular application. To explore this concept, I've implemented some image lazy loading using the intersection observer, and you'll see now as I scroll down the page, we're getting more network activity. So as images come into the browser's viewport, we can even see the full URL there. You can see that as I'm scrolling, more and more images are loading. And if I go into the console, I'm going to clear this, you can see that each one of these images also logs here. And let's actually refresh. And if we refresh and we look at the elements, what we will see is a giant list of paragraphs, but within each paragraph is an image. And this first one loaded, so you can see that the source attribute on the image has shown up. However, if we go down to one of the paragraphs later on, what we can see here is that there is no source attribute. We have this ng reflect app viewport intersection source, but then we also have this data expando. So what we're going to be doing is using the expando property to keep track of an image element and associate it with one of the intersection observer callbacks. And then as we scroll down, what you'll notice eventually is that this expando will be replaced with the source of an image. Come on, let's get to it. Where is it? It's in here somewhere. There it goes. And you can see now the source attribute has been added and that expando property has been removed. So what's going on? Let's look at our app component. So app component, here is our list of paragraphs. And inside each paragraph, as I mentioned, we have an image tag. And you can see that we're not setting the source property of the image. Instead, we're using this app viewport intersection source directive and giving it the source of the image. Now this directive is going to use an underlying service that manages the intersection observer, and it's going to lazy apply this source to the source property. So let's take a quick look at how this directive is working. This directive doesn't really do much on its own. Instead, it injects this viewport intersection service, and then inside the ng on init for the directive, you can see we're taking that intersection service and we're adding the native element for the image. And this viewport intersection service is going to be using the intersection observer API under the hood to keep track of this element. And when this element intersects with the browser's viewport, this callback is going to be invoked, at which point we take that input binding and we apply it to the source attribute of the host element. So let's now take a look at what the intersection, this viewport intersection service is doing, because that's where our expando DOM properties come into play. Now, the viewport intersection service is going to be using the intersection observer API under the hood, and the way the intersection observer works is that you give it a callback, and this callback gets invoked by the browser when any of the entries in its collection intersects with the viewport, and this callback is provided with specifically the elements that either are now intersecting or have stopped intersecting with the viewport. And we're going to be calling handle entries, and if we jump down to that, what happens is that we have this list of entries, but we don't actually know which callback to fire based on the view model, right? Because if we look back at our directive, when we call add target, we're passing an element and a callback. So we need to be able to associate this element with this callback, but when the browser calls the handler for the intersection API, the intersection observer API, all we get is the entries. We don't get the callback. So we need to be able to map the DOM to our callback. So this is again that case where the view model, quote unquote, in Angular isn't sufficient to drive all of the logic. Instead, we have to use the DOM as one of the sources of truth within our application and then map that DOM to the appropriate callback. And in this case, we're going to be doing that using Expando properties. And that's going to take part, or that's going to be implemented using this unset callback and set. So let's just actually jump back here. I'm sorry, I'm going off script here a little bit. So when we call add target, which again is what our directive is calling, we take that target and we'll map it to a callback using this set callback. So if we jump down to set callback, what that does is it injects the Expando property, that Expando DOM property, which we covered in the last blog post, into that target, and that returns the unique ID for that Expando property instance. We then use that unique ID to add to a lookup index that maps this target to this callback, right? So we're caching the callback inside this lookup object using that Expando ID. Now, when we have our handle entries, which handles the viewport intersection, you can see that we're calling unset callback. And when we jump down to unset callback, what that does is it, again, uses that Expando service to take that target element, which we got back from our IntersectionObserver callback. That returns the Expando ID. We then use that Expando ID to look up the callback in our internal cache, and then we return that cached callback, which all that does at that point is turn around and pass it to safely invoke callback. So that's how, again, we're using this, right? We can jump down to another one here. We're using this data Expando. So this 32 value, right? Let's go back to our set callback. I don't know why it doesn't actually take me there. That 32 value, which is getting injected into the host element, right? 32 right here. That is then being used as the lookup ID or the object key in this callback index, which is simply a key value pair that maps Expando IDs to callbacks. So now, as I scroll down and this image intersects with the viewport, the intersection observer receives this element, right? We'll go back up to our handle. We'll receive this element in the list of entries. It then extracts that Expando ID, right, 32. It uses that to look up the callback in the internal cache. It then passes that callback to the safely invoke callback, which is just invoking that callback inside of a try catch. So again, as we scroll down, what we'll see is that Expando ID gets replaced with the lazy evaluation of the source. And you can see the source here has been set and the Expando property has been removed from the DOM. And that's how we can use the Expando DOM property concept to facilitate mapping between the document object model and Angular's view model when the view model isn't 100% sufficient for implementing the Angular logic.